Okay. So, first lesson we're doing, DT1, role of the dive leader. So this kind of just goes over why you'd become a dive leader and what's the point. Before we get into it, I just have a load of points for housekeeping, I'm afraid. Start of the year is always this kind of stuff. So very first thing, questions. If you've got any questions throughout the lesson, just interrupt me, please do. Put your hand up, type in the chat, whatever you want to do. Just interrupt me, because there's no point waiting to the end and then forgetting what you were going to ask. So just interrupt me. There's a couple of quizzes throughout this presentation, I think. We'll literally just have people talking through microphones. There's only a couple of you, so it's not going to turn into a mess. So that should be okay. Lectures this time spot every single week. Is that okay with everyone? Is that going to be a problem at all?
Yeah, it should be.
No,
It's
I'm
fine.
happy with it.
I just
Yeah,
have
it's
a
fine.
question that so this is what 5 till 6, and then sports diver is 6 till 7. When are we doing ocean diver lectures? Are we doing it the slot before this one?
Ocean
It's the same
diver at
one.
the same time as sports diver. I'll finish this a little bit early, so you'll have time to move over to those. So don't worry
Okay.
too much about that. We may start this a little bit earlier on some sessions, just in case, because some of the lectures have loads of content, and then some of them have basically nothing. So just keep an eye out on your emails for any changes to the time, is what I'd say. But
Okay.
it'll be roughly 5 o'clock, plus or minus half an hour kind of thing. Lectures are all going to be recorded and then put on the YouTube channel. The link to that will be pasted around the Facebook pages and YouTube channel. So about finding that lecture, just watch it again. Just come to me afterwards and ask them. Some of you have completed the member details form that we sent out through email a couple of days ago. If you haven't, please do, because it's going to make our lives a hell of a lot easier organising training. It just asks you for basic details, but it is really helpful. Go Dive Visit is currently being organised. We're kind of waiting to see if we can or see if we can book rooms rather. For you guys, it's probably not going to be particularly interesting, but you should be aware that we now get 10% off all the Go Dive stuff. So if you have any dive gear, have a look there because we get a decent discount. Trips again are in the planning. Anglesey was meant to be happening next weekend, but that is no longer happening. I don't know if anyone's seen the news as of about an hour ago, but they've announced they're going to start banning travel from parts of England into Wales. So I suspect Leicester's going to be on that list, and it'll be a little bit questionable if we did go. So that's probably a good thing.
I'm not banned yet, actually in Derbyshire.
Yeah. Well, we'll see, won't we? I think they haven't actually said where they're gonna ban, but I wouldn't be surprised if they included Leicestershire in it.
Yeah,
we'll see. Other trips are going to be announced at a later date, just because we need to see how COVID's going. I know a lot of other dive clubs are kind of restricting their trips this year, so we're just going to have to be a little bit of a wait and see game this year, I'm afraid. BZAC resources, you guys should all be aware of this, especially the instructors. But those who aren't, the BZAC website has fantastic resources on it, especially after lockdown. They've got a massive list of videos on all sorts of topics, from how to assemble basic scuba kit to how to build a rebreather by yourself kind of stuff. It's a real range. So go and have a look on their website for some good training videos. Also, they've got a good search function, so if you're ever looking for something documentation wise, just go and search it. Is everyone here in the members group on Facebook? I think we sent a link out for that a while ago.
Yeah.
If you're not, go and join that, please, because we will be announcing stuff in there and it's worth being involved in that. There's no crossovers with us today. Abby is a crossover, so this was more aimed at her, but there's going to be a refresher pool session in week 3. Open water training, we're going to try and get dive leaders in before Christmas. So please try and make sure you're free on the weekends. It's a tricky one for dive leaders because you've got a lot to do in open water, and Stony Cove is not being particularly helpful with booking, but we'll see what we can do with working
Yes,
around
Chris.
sports dive.
The cars into Stony these days.
Sorry, go again, Kev.
Do we have to book the vehicles in Stony still?
No, we just have to book tickets for people, so it doesn't matter what cars we bring, I don't think.
Oh, right, okay.
So even if you just turn up and don't want to dive, they won't charge you or anything. You just get waved in.
Okay.
I
Right
think it's
on,
just
that's
a
all right.
restriction on the people. That's all.
All right. Okay.
Cool. Instructor training program. Right. So 3 of our 4. Oh no, all 4. I'm included, aren't I? All 4 of our instructors are in this room. Obviously, this is targeted to someone in particular, but if you're interested in getting in the instructor program, just talk to me. Basically, someone's at the door. Classic. Training packs. So dive leader training packs. IMI has one. Does anyone else already have a dive leader training pack? Just so we know.
No.
No. Matt, do you have one?
Sorry, what was that?
Do you have a training pack for dive leader already?
No, I don't.
No. Okay, right. We'll get those ordered as soon as possible. That's partly why we need the member details form. So just try and fill that out quickly, and we'll get those ordered and distributed out.
I'll do that now.
Cool. Amazon classic. Lovely. Right. Aim of the course. So let's get on to the particularly interesting stuff. So, what is the point of becoming a dive leader? Ultimately, it's to extend that development of diving skills that you've been progressing through the diving qualifications you've done so far. So, ocean diver, you start off as a basically no idea what you're doing, and you finish off with kind of an idea of what you're doing, just enough so you don't die underwater. Is basically the point of ocean diver. Sports diver, you learn a couple more skills, and you progress the ones you've already learned in ocean diver. And dive leader is just the same. You'll learn some more skills as well, and expand that experience. You've also got the option to do some depth progression. So I know some of you have done depth progression for sports divers, others haven't. It's much the same. You'll start off at 35 meters, you'll do a dive to 40, 45, and then 50. So you can get to 50 meters with dive leader, which is pretty fucking deep. Develop existing dive leading skills. So you guys now are getting to a point where you're the role models of the club, not just of your buddy pair. Most of the people in here are now on committee, which kind of goes to show that. As a dive leader, it's kind of in the name, you're going to be leading less qualified divers. So be ready to be called upon to lead that brand new ocean diver on the trip who's not particularly confident, and be the one to guide them through that. You'll also be responsible for leading divers of equal experience, so diving in buddy pairs with other dive leaders. You'd be surprised how many dive leaders you find out in the real non-university world, so be ready for that. And you'll also get to broaden your role in the branch. So again, you'll get onto committee. You don't necessarily have to be committee, you can just help out, or you can be on the instructor team as well. So there's loads of ways to get involved. Ultimately, dive leader qualifies you to manage dive sites for known sites. So advanced diver is what qualifies you to manage dives on unknown sites. So let's say we're going to Stony Cove, a dive leader can manage that, or I don't know, Cape and Ray, I suppose you could make a case for. But places like the Farne Islands or Anglesey really is meant to be an advanced diver. You're also looked on for rescue support and management. At this point, you've pretty much perfected your rescue skills, and you're starting to really develop your management skills for rescue scenarios. So if anything does happen, you'll be looked at as a useful tool rather than just someone to get out of the way, like an ocean diver would be. Cool. So what does it actually consist of? It's a little bit different to the other courses. So first off, you've got 12 theory lessons rather than 4 in ocean diver. So it's a little bit more theory, but some of them are interesting. Some of them are a little bit monotonous. We'll do our best to make them interesting. Normally we have a classroom where we can kind of show and tell some interesting things, but it's a little bit tricky over Teams, but we'll see how we get on. You've also got 7 open water lessons. So a lot more than ocean diver and sports diver. There is quite a lot of content to get through. You will need to be committed to those open water weekends, unfortunately. You'll also have 2 practical lessons. So they're really referring to your dive management practice. In sports dive, you did assistant dive manager, or will be in Joel's case. And now you're going to be a full-on dive manager, and there's 2 lessons for that. At the end of the theory lessons, you'll have to do a theory assessment, which is much the same as the other two exams. It's just on dive leader content. And then you've got to get a load of different experience dives as well. So certain numbers of dives, different conditions, that kind of stuff. Once you get hold of your training packs, you'll see a list of what you need to tick off. But off the top of my head, I think it's 6 boat dives. Is it 10 dive leads? Those who have the training packs already? Something like that.
I can get it out. I'll tell you.
I think it's 10 dive leads, then 10 dives below 25 meters.
If I can remember.
8 dive leads, 10 under 25 meters, and 6 boat dives.
There you go. So you've got to tick off those. The boat dives tend to be the one that take the while because you have to go on holiday basically and all on trips to get those. Ultimately, as you can see, there's quite a lot to get through. You need to be committed to this. It's not something you can just spend a single weekend on and get signed off. It's unlikely you'll probably complete this in this academic year. It's something you'll have to work on across the years. But this is a high level qualification, so once you do achieve it, you will be a very high level diver. So it's not something to rush really, which is why they have those numbers for the dive limits. You'll also need to do a bit of self-study for the theory assessment. It is more in depth, but it's the same kind of thing you've done in the past, so don't worry too much about it. And I would encourage you to take any notes from these lectures. You will have a student guide in the training pack, but it's always good to have notes because it makes you remember it better. You'll also get in the training pack the dive leading manual, which is quite useful for just kind of general questions about diving. I think it's also available on the BZAT website. So, personal skill development. This is one section of the dive leader course. You need to extend that diving experience. So you can do that by varied sites, varied conditions. You could also choose to do that depth progression we talked about. And especially at this level, you need to ensure you're practicing the skills that you've learned in the past to make sure they're still up to scratch. Can anyone think of skills that they haven't done since doing the training? Because there's always going to be someone will have done a mass clear and not done it since their training, or CBLs, that kind of thing. Anyone got anything that comes to mind?
Not done a DSMB since.
There you go. DSMB is a good one. A lot of people end up just not doing a DSMB until sports diver.
Or just being bad.
Yeah, or just being bad in James's case. Those who came to Farne Islands, now you realise why they're important. Yeah, because you often have mid-water ascents where you don't really have a nice cliff to come up like you do in Stony Cove.
Or lobster pot lines.
Yeah. And then you knock all the seaweed off like Leo did. That was classic, that was. So yeah, it's about keeping those skills up to scratch, making sure you're able to do them in the real world. And on top of that, if you're going to be doing the instructor program, you need to be absolutely perfect at your skills because you are an example to those trainees. So any little slight problems you have with the skills, they're going to transfer that to them, and then they're just going to make a habit out of it. So you've got to do a bit of self-risk assessment at this point. You're experienced enough to know when it's not safe to do the dive. So a little bit of knowing your personal risks. So knowing that, yeah, it says I can go to 50 meters, but actually I'm not particularly comfortable at that depth. I shouldn't be doing it until I've progressed down to there and done it progressively. You also need to be staying within your own comfort factor. I would say to an extent, obviously you're going to need to go slightly outside your comfort zone just to progress, but not pushing it to an unreasonable limit. I don't know if anyone's seen that graph of kind of knowledge about a subject versus confidence, and it's this weird curve where you start off with no confidence, and then in the middle, when you kind of know what you're doing, you have an excessive amount of confidence. A lot of people fall into that trap right around dive leader because they think they're at the top of the game, they know everything, they're indestructible as divers. The truth is, dive leaders are actually one of the most susceptible to injuries because of the incident report. So it just goes to show we aren't indestructible at this level. Your equipment is starting to develop a little bit more. So who's got their own equipment in here?
Me.
Yeah, obviously Kevin's got about 7 sets, hasn't he? Imi has. I think Tom's got some. James has got some. I don't know about Matt. I think Joel's not got any.
Dry suits, like 6
I need a dry suit.
So we're all looking at dry suits. Okay, so why are we getting dry suits, guys? It's an obvious question, but
bloody cold.
Because it's cold.
It's cold, yeah, because it's the right equipment for the diving we're doing, isn't it? Okay, we dive in the UK, it's freezing cold. The dives we start doing, especially at depth, are more challenging and, quite frankly, more cold. So dry suit does tend to be the first thing people get. The other thing is having adequate gas supply. So those who went on Farne Islands, we did a dive to about 30 meters. Did you notice that your gas was running down pretty quick? You didn't actually have a huge amount of time on the bottom. Whereas Kev here has got his bloody... Yeah, well, Kev here has got his bloody twin set and he could stay down for 3 years. Mike, on the other hand, I mean, he's showing off. He's got a rebreather. So it's thinking about different types of equipment that will allow you to stay on the bottom a bit longer. The other thing with that is your independent reserve. So with Kev, let's take his twin set as an example. If one of his regulators fails for whatever reason, he has a hose go and it's just pissing out the air, he can isolate that and still use the kit. So he has a bit of independent redundancy or independent reserve. So that's something you want to start building into your equipment as you start doing these deeper, more challenging dives.
That's Kev's slob knob, isn't it?
Does Kev have a
That's
slop? Oh yeah, he does, doesn't he? Yeah.
Up on the tens, and then but you can isolate them so you can dive as an individual set as well. You want to see that?
Sorry, say that again, Kev.
You can isolate them so you can get yourself out of the situation. But if
Yeah.
you want a single, you can get a 3 litre and strap it to the side and have that as a bailout gas.
Yep. So we've got pony cylinders. I'm not sure if they cover that in detail here. I think people covered it in Sports Diver, but yeah, absolutely right. You can have pony cylinders, also known as suicide bottles. But yeah. Right, building experience. How do we build experience? Instructors. What's the main word when it comes to building experience? Come on, someone answer.
Practice.
Practice.
Practice
What's-
again.
Does PAVE ring a bell for your acronyms?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That rings a bell. Do you remember what the first word stands for? Or the first letter?
Practice.
Not
That's
practice.
very
No, I'm afraid not.
Is it progressive?
Progressive, absolutely. So we want to do our progressive development. What's the point? Why do we do it progressively?
So that you can build it up more easily and like work on each more difficult bit at a time rather than just all of it at once.
Yeah, so you're breaking it down into little steps. Let's say we've only done a dive to 20 meters as a sports diver who's never done depth regression. And now we're getting into dive leader, which after depth regression gets us to 50 meters. That's more than double what we were previously qualified to. Are we just going to wing it all the way down to 50 meters first time, or are you going to take it bit by bit, make sure we identify the problems? Because there's things at 20 meters you don't realize until you get to 35 meters that actually you need a torch, or you need more gas, or you need to think about decompression a little bit more. So building up that experience in little bits means we don't run into issues all at once. We take them one at a time. So like I said, deeper, more challenging dives is really important for this. So depth regression, the reason it's done in 5 meter intervals is to build you up to that ultimate goal of 50 meters. You want to make sure you're with an appropriate buddy. So if you're progressing in your experience, you don't want to do it with someone who's also progressing in their experience, because you're both going to get in trouble if you find a problem that you're not familiar with. Avoiding pressure to extend your experience. Who feels comfortable right now to go down to 50 meters or do their depth regression tomorrow?
Me?
Apart from Kev, he's a show off. Anyone? You shouldn't, is the point. So if I said to you, right, come on, we'll go do our depth regression to 50 meters tomorrow, would you do it?
No.
Exactly. There's no point getting pressured into it because ultimately you're not comfortable doing it. And like I said earlier about the confidence at this kind of level, never get complacent. There's always something to improve on. There's always a mistake you'll make, but that's how we learn from it. Your experience doesn't mean you're invincible, does it, Kev?
No,
With your
it
dry
doesn't.
suit zips.
At least I got out of the situation and sorted myself out.
Yeah, that's true. So a good example of this little point with small errors. James Creasy I'm going to put him on the spot here. We went to Capernwray the other day, and he was trying to do a DSMB. And with Dive Leader, you have to do a mid-water DSMB. So you have to hover with no visual reference. Now, he was trying to do this with a visual reference just to build it up in that progressive manner we were talking about. What I didn't notice was as he was fiddling with his DSMB, his buoyancy was ever so slightly positive. So he started going up. Now, at 2 meters, that's not going to be a big issue. But if he had that 50 meters, what ended up happening was he didn't realize he started filling the DSMB. Might add, not very much. But he started filling the DSMB. His octopus free flowed because he didn't realize that it was on the Venturi valve was on plus, which confused him, distracted him, and before he knew it, he was at the surface from 6 meters. So if we did that 50 meters with the octopus free flowing, the DSMB in our hand, not really sure what to focus on, that probably would have ended up with a trip to the chamber. So you got to notice these tiny little errors, that just ever so slight positive buoyancy just ran away, and at depth that could potentially be lethal. So you have to be really careful with that sort of stuff. It comes back to these personal limits. So you've got to do the diving you want. So if you don't want to do 50 meters, don't do it. It's not a trophy you have to achieve. And in all honesty, apart from Scaffer, there's nothing at 50 meters. Anyway. Say again, Kev.
It's not a tick off box situation.
Absolutely. It's something you can do if you want to. You don't have to do it.
You don't have to do it. You can do it at your own leisure.
Exactly. So it's not a rush. There's no compulsion to do it. You don't have to do it. And then you've got this challenge of diving addressed by preparation and anticipation. So as diving trainees, we've spent years preparing for this level of diving, haven't we? And it's getting more and more challenging. Okay. So shuffling along relatively quickly. Various sites and conditions. Normally I'd ask you guys to kind of name some different sites, but we're just going to quickly tick some off. So you can have different types of dives, so reef or wall diving. You can have wrecks, your drift diving, night diving, deeper diving, etc. So there's loads of different variety in type of diving you can do. If you just want to do reefs in the Mediterranean, go for it. You don't have to do anything you don't want to do. Night diving, you can do at Stony. You can do deeper diving at Stony as well. Drift diving is a fairly unique one. It's quite fun. Some people don't like it, but it comes back to needing to do DSMBs and SMB skills as well. So each of these environments require a certain skill. You also have your known and unknown sites. So a lot of us are now relatively familiar with where Stony, or navigating in Stony rather, and how it works. Whereas if we went off to Eccleston Delph, most of you have never been there, and you would have no idea where you're going, what the hazards are. What you probably wouldn't realise is Eccleston Delph has horrendous visibility past 15 metres. So that's something you wouldn't be prepared for because it's an unknown site. A little bit more detail, reef and wall diving. This is relatively self-explanatory, so I'm going to go through this relatively quickly. Obviously, it's spectacular scenery. Reefs aren't restricted to the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. They're in the UK as well. Those who've been on Farne Islands have seen the lovely coral walls that we got. On the flip side of this, it does generate a slight sense of complacency. You can see nice blue waters, see the surface from 30 meters. It doesn't feel that deep. You end up going a little bit deeper than you thought because it's all light. It's not a big problem. And then you get hit by narcosis and then you start swimming deeper and deeper and deeper and then you die. So it's one of those ones which is pretty, but it can actually be quite dangerous if you're not paying attention. The other thing is with walls, particularly, your buoyancy control is important. There's nothing to stop you shooting down to the bottom. And if the bottom is at 70 meters, that's not going to be good for you. So you've got to be good with your buoyancy control. Currents is an interesting one with walls because you can get vertical currents which push you up or down the wall. So you've got to be a bit careful with local information, whether there's a vertical current in that area. And then again, you've got to be careful monitoring everything. Wreck diving, kind of attractions. I mean, it's pretty obvious what the attractions are to this. Wrecks are pretty awesome. Some of them have amazing history behind them, like the ones up at Scapa. Does everyone know about Scapa?
Yes.
What it is? Yeah, I know you know, Kev. Does anyone not know what Scapa Flow is up in Scotland? You don't. Okay, so
It's a
very
German
quick.
fleet, wasn't it?
It absolutely was. So in the First World War, I don't know if you guys are interested in this, but I thought I'd mention it. First World War, Germany got defeated. Britain captured their naval fleet, their entire naval fleet, and they moved them up to a place called Scapa Flow in Scotland, with German sailors on them under prisoner. German sailors decided that the British weren't having their ships, so instead of let the British have the ships, they decided to scuttle them or sink them. So the entire First World War German Navy is sunk up at Scapa Flow. So there's some amazing ships you can go and dive up there. So the history behind these places is a huge attraction in some cases.
Some of the ships have been salvaged, actually.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, some of them have been lifted up. A lot of them are in not the best condition, but some of them are still in pretty amazing condition. And on that note, risk assessment, you've got to be careful of the ship's hazards. So you've got broken structures that you can get caught on. Some of them are weak, so if you put a force on a bar, it might fall on you and then you're trapped. You can get sharp edges from rusty bits of metal that can cut through your dry suit, cut through you. Obviously, you get a lot of lines and nets with wrecks. So as we all know, we dive with a knife. For that very reason. Lost gas supply, yeah, pretty obvious stuff. You can also get, with these wrecks, low visibility. Why is that a big issue with wrecks? Any ideas?
Lose the way to the exit.
Lose the way to exit. If you've been inside a wreck and it's slightly windy as to where you've got, you kick up a load of silt, you are not finding your way out of that place, which is why in sports diving you get taught how to use a distance line so you can use it in situations like that. A lot of that low visibility is from silt. You also get it from rust. So if you kick a rusty surface, some of you who've been to Hydrobox might have noticed this, you'll get a lot of silt in the water. You also get low light levels, obviously, because you're inside something. This generally increases your risk of buddy separation, which obviously isn't good. And you end up getting disorientated, all that sort of stuff. Tides are quite important as well because these act as artificial barriers to the tide, so you can get some slightly strange tidal movements, up currents and that sort of stuff. So you've got to be careful of your depth as well. So what kind of safeguards can we take with wreck diving? Site information is probably the main one. You want to be able to know where you are on the wreck. You want to be able to plan your dive on the wreck for tidal conditions. And you also want to monitor the area for lines and nets. It's also important to have your good buoyancy and finning control. Why particularly finning control?
So you don't kick everything on the way in. So you don't.
Correct, Amundo, yeah. So your visibility is going to be severely hindered if your finning control is poor. You don't always have to enter the openings. You've got to consider whether they're safe, whether you've got overhead constraints. So are you qualified to penetrate that wreck? You've also got to realise that your exit point always remains in view. Now, if you go in, your exit point may remain in view for a couple of minutes and then it's covered by silt. So you've got to consider that as well. And then your equipment. So like I said, distance line, DSMB is worth having, knife and net cutter, that kind of thing, just to get you out of snags if you need to. The other thing, inside wrecks, it's pretty dark, so a torch is normally quite handy. So labouring on about wrecks. So wrecks present a restriction to your ability to ascend. So you've got to take into account the fact that you won't be able to just shoot to the surface in an emergency. So you can agree in a buddy pair what the steps you'll take is if there's an emergency. Again, exit kept in view at all times. It'll be worth extending the experience with an experienced buddy. So those who have been in Stony Cove with me to the Staingarth, some of you might have gone through the Staingarth, which isn't exactly a massive wreck, but it's a wreck nonetheless. But you were doing it with me, who've been through the Staingarth countless times, so I kind of know what to expect and where I'm going. So it's important to have that experience with you. And obviously you've got to be careful with your gas planning. So you've got to be able to have gas in case of emergency. You can't just shoot to the surface. As a final little warning, don't enter small openings because there's a good chance you won't be able to get back out. Any opening if the visibility is greatly reduced for obvious reasons. Ultimately, this stuff requires extra training, which we are not going to do in this course. So moving on, drift diving. This is generally for when you have a current. It's quite a strange feeling being pushed along by the current, but it's like flying along and it's kind of relaxing until you want to stop, because then you've got to fight against the current. But you got to be really careful of separation here, because you're not the one moving. It's the current is moving you. So you got to be careful of separation from your buddy, from your surface cover. So we always dive with an SMB in drift dives, so the surface cover can see where the divers are at all times. But if you're in a buddy pair and one of you has the SMB and you get separated, the person without the SMB is a little bit screwed. So be careful with that. Visibility can be a little bit tricky. Sometimes it's very good, sometimes it's not great, because the current's kicking up all the silt off the bottom. It kind of depends on the dive site. Obviously, you get a bit of turbulence if the bottom isn't perfectly smooth, which it never is, and you get up and down currents if it comes up against a wall. Entanglement's quite a big one, because if you get tangled in a net or something and the current's still trying to drag you, it's quite difficult to unhook yourself from that net because it's still being loaded. So be careful of that one. Always dive with a knife, and you'll also get more cold quickly. Why is that?
The constant flow of water, like you're always getting fresh water over the top of you rather than just like your little bubble.
Yeah, exactly. And that'll just result in increased gas consumption. So keep that in mind. Some of the safeguards you can take, you've got to know where that current's going, really. Most places you'll be able to predict it. There's certain resources you can get, which we'll cover in a later lecture, which will tell you exactly how the current moves and what times. You want to avoid areas where the water's rough, so that they're marked on nautical charts, which we'll also cover in another lecture. You want to be careful there's no major obstructions. So Kev's got a good story of him doing a drift dive where he was going along quite nicely, and then there was a massive boulder right in front of his face, which ended up. Didn't you bounce off it, Kev, or was that a buddy?
It was actually a slab. It was just like a ski lift. It was like a little slope, and it just literally just pushed me up to the surface.
Yeah, so you got to be really careful of that sort of stuff. You got to be aware of the visibility, because if you have poor visibility, you're flying along however many knots, you end up doing what Kev did.
It's a bit more.
You got to be aware of the fact that depth can change if you're going that quickly. Obviously, when we're finning around, we're going pretty slow, so the depth is pretty manageable. But sometimes if you're chugging along at a rate of knots, your depth can change quite quickly. And again, your buoyancy control on top of that is quite important. So equipment special for this, you always want to have boat cover for drift dives, because you want to be able to have something that can come and get you when you've buggered off somewhere else. And you always want to have a surface marker. Maybe consider additional thermal protection. The truth is, in UK diving, we're already fairly protected from the cold, so normally that's sufficient. And you've got to be careful of your planning. Night diving. So what's the point in night diving? Anyone?
So you can cancel it just to do some try dives.
Absolutely, that's the main attraction now. Yeah, so night diving. You get a lot of different marine life. So like we do on land with nocturnal animals, you get nocturnal marine life. A lot of that is corals that will come out at night to feed. You get all sorts of different life that's reactive to UV light. I don't know if anyone's seen those pictures of really bright corals that are like neon green and all that sort of stuff. You get a lot of that on night diving. They've got a point here for more focused on what the torch beam reveals. Sure. Okay, I guess. Risk assessing night dives, obviously separation from the buddy is tricky, but if you think about it, both of you will have torches, so actually it's quite easy to see people from a distance. It's just identifying which person's your buddy from the multitude of torches. It's also quite easy to get disorientated, especially in mid-water. If it's dark and you're in mid-water, you've got nothing to point your torch at, and you've got no idea which way you're pointing, so you've got to be careful of that. So a good idea is to have a daylight orientation of a dive site. So with Stony Cove, we can do night dives, but we've all been in Stony Cove before. We roughly know what it's like. We've done that in daylight, and so it's probably pretty safe for us to do it in night dive. It's also worth doing a sheltered and calm area. There's no point doing a drift dive at night because you can't really see anything. You don't want to do it deep, although to be honest, at depth, everything goes dark anyway. And you want to make sure it's good visibility, because otherwise, what's the point? Special equipment, it's worth having a torch, and it's also definitely worth having a backup. And a backup torch, that is, not a backup glow stick. as Tom found out at 30 meters. Glow sticks don't really work in cold water.
So,
They work brilliantly on the surface, but as they get in cold water, the reaction slows down and they stop working entirely. So don't use that as a backup. That's not a good idea. You also want a SMB, also with a torch or a light stick, as they call it, a glow stick. This is good for your surface cover, so it's easy to see where you are. Would we have a strobe on that, or just a solid light? Any ideas?
You could put one on. You could put one on.
I would say just a solid light, because if someone gets confused and think you're sending out an SOS signal, I know they're not the same, but if someone did look at it and got confused, then they might think
Absolutely.
die.
BZAC recommend that you don't put a strobe on the surface marker. The reality is most people do, because it's more noticeable. So don't panic if you see a strobe, but just keep that in mind. Obviously, it's worth knowing where the boat is, so a little bit of light on the boat probably won't go amiss. Right, deep diving. We're getting on for time, so I'm just going to chug through these real quick. Obviously, the attractions for deep diving are you get rarely visited areas, and the wrecks tend to be more intact. This is mainly because you get less surface traffic at that kind of depth, and the currents tend to be less dramatic. Obviously, your risk assessment is going to include risks of DCI, nitrogen narcosis, your gas density, so it's a bit more difficult to breathe for those who've been deeper. Don't know if you've noticed that. You'll also get a reduction in light. I'm sure everyone's noticed that at Stony Cove. And then your distance back to the surface is significantly increased, so rescues are a little bit more difficult. It can actually take a minute or two, maybe even 3 to get back to the surface from kind of 35 meters, even if you're just finning upwards. So just keep that in mind. With decompression diving, you actually have a ceiling on your diving. You can't just shoot up to the surface. So it's basically like a wreck dive where you're penetrating the wreck and you've got an overhead condition. So you've got to be really careful that in emergencies, you're capable of dealing with that underwater. You don't need to shoot to the surface. So safeguards, deep diving, you're always going to have a high level of experience. Like we said earlier, progressive build up for the reasons we described. And you want to be able to, well, you want to make sure you're actually in practice. We'll dismiss that. There's no point doing a 50-meter dive when you haven't dived for 2 years, because that's just going to end in tears. Obviously, you're going to have to plan these a lot more in depth. With 30 meters, you don't have to plan it too rigorously. If you're doing something ridiculous like 200 meters, it could take weeks to plan something like that with build-up dives and that kind of thing. So it's a sliding scale on that kind of area. You've got to make sure your conditions are right for the dive as well. There's no point kind of going for a 50-meter dive if there's a massive current at 50 meters or your visibility is awful. The obvious depth considerations. Your breathing rate. So as we all know, the surface breathing rate is 25 litres per minute. At depth, you're going to increase that amount of litres per second you're using because you have to breathe at a higher pressure. We all know that from our sports diver. So with a deeper dive, your breathing rate is going to increase. You also have to be aware of narcosis. We all know what that is, don't we? Yeah. You also need to be able to have independent backup gas supplies. Really, at this depth, you need to be able to have separate gas supplies in case there's an emergency. Someone's octopus really isn't sufficient at this point. You need to have isolation manifold twins or something like that, or a bailout cylinder. That comes under equipment, so you need to be totally familiar with your equipment as well. There's no point diving a new rig to you because that is not the time and place to be learning the issue you have with not being able to reach your inflator hose. So known sites, I think we're pretty much getting there. Only a couple more slides. Any type of known sites, the attraction to that is you know where you're going, you know what's interesting, you know what's worth looking at. Simple as that. The problem with this is you already know a lot of factors, but can the conditions change? For those who went to Stony Cove just after it opened, the visibility was, no joke, 30 centimetres. It is the worst I've ever seen it. I've also seen visibility at Stony that's 10 metres. So just because it's a known site doesn't mean it's just totally safe to dive because your conditions can change. You also need to consider the experience level of the divers you're taking. So obviously we, as a instructor group, we plan the diving based on who we're taking. So if we're taking dive leaders, we kind of expect you guys to be self-sufficient underwater. Whereas if we're doing ocean divers, they need a bit more supervision. Safeguards for that, obviously never get complacent. They love that. And thorough dive planning and the right equipment for the dive. Okay. Moving on swiftly, unknown sites. Funnily enough, that looks like Farne Islands, maybe. The attraction to this is it's a bit more exploratory. There's a bit more stuff to discover. So me and Kev did the dive in Farne Islands where we had that wreck that just kind of popped out of nowhere. Wasn't really expecting it, so that's kind of cool. But on the flip side of that, you don't really know the site that well or the conditions it gets. In Stony, we know that in February it gets freezing cold. We don't really know that much information about other sites. Safeguards to this really is just gather as much site information as you possibly can, so local knowledge and that sort of stuff. We're going to cover all of this in much more depth in another lecture. And you've also got to consider that experience level. With unknown sites, is it smart to be taking a brand new ocean diver trainee? Right, nearly there. 4 more slides. So, preparing to lead the less experienced diver. You are ultimately a role model now. You're going to need to be assessing that buddy for their prior experience, their general actions. They may not have reached to that level. So you guys are just totally competent on mass clears, totally competent on your airs ascents, that sort of stuff. You kind of take that for granted a little bit. You just assume, oh, I've got water in my mask, I'll just clear it, not even think about it. Whereas now you've got to think, oh, my buddy might not know how to do that. I might have to help them if they need it. Some buddies you'll get are eager, some are a little bit wary, and some are absolutely bricking it. You need to be able to cope with all of those and adapt to that and be able to be helpful to every single one of those buddies. So the eager ones not really hold them back, but the nervous ones encourage them to keep going. You need to assess whether those conditions are suitable. You all know what it's like to dive in terrible visibility or freezing cold water. So you need to realize that terrible visibility is not the place to take an ocean diver. You need to consider the breathing gas. You're likely to use very little gas compared to your less experienced diver. I know some people are like bloody fish, Joel, but others chug through it, especially the newer divers. So you really have to keep that in mind. If you're checking your gauges all the time, oh yeah, I've got 150 bar left, while your buddy's got 50 bar left because they go and chug through it. You've got to keep that in mind. And then on top of that, have an adequate backup. So you may find some of the instructors in open water dive with a 15 litre or a twin set, just because then they know that if there's an out of air situation for their buddy, they've got plenty of gas to resort to doing AS. And then your equipment, do you need anything to help that newer buddy? Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty obvious point, to be honest. So leading the less experienced. Ultimately, you need to give them a safe and enjoyable experience. So you give the plan to the dive manager, you give them a clear SEEDS brief. Does everyone know what SEEDS stands for? I think we cover it in Sports Diver, don't we?
I don't think so. I think it's just IFC.
It's in Sports Diver, yeah.
It's in Sports Diver. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's briefly covered in Sports Diver. It's absolutely drilled into you in the IFC, which is probably why I think it's in the IFC. So nice SEEDS brief. It's a good template. You don't have to follow it to the letter. So I was talking to James and Imi the other day about how you can do that. So you don't have to absolutely do it safety exercise one at a time. You can mix it in as long as you get all the points. You're going to have to assist them in kitting up. Because a lot of us are kind of used to chucking it on the back of our boot lids and putting it on ourselves. They might need a bit of help. You're going to need to do a buddy check fairly thoroughly just to make sure that they haven't forgotten anything. And then you might need to assist them on the entry. Monitor them throughout the dive, see if there's any signs of panic, anything like that. If they're cold and they're not telling you, that kind of thing. And then maybe just point out to them, what you're doing for navigation, what's interesting. They're going to be focused on, not dying underwater. If you point out the stain gas to them, they're going to be pretty impressed. So do that sort of stuff. Makes it a bit more interesting. A system on exit and D-kit, obviously helping people off with their kit is always really good, especially if people are less experienced. And then do a quick debrief. I know the instructors will know this, but do sports divers get the acronym for debriefs? I'm not sure.
Don't think so.
Don't think so. So
Yeah, I
it's
don't
REAP.
think so.
We'll probably cover that in a later lecture, but REAP is the acronym for a debrief. And then
Review,
record your dive. Oh,
encourage,
go on, James. Go
assess,
on,
and
James.
preview. Review, encourage, assess, and preview. I've got it written down for tonight.
Oh, very impressive. Right. So record the dive, send those details to your dive manager. So we've got a dive slate, and keep a logbook. It's always nice to log how many dives you've done and what kind of conditions you've done them in. And it's also good if you want experienced dives signed off in future. Very close. So leading experienced divers, you guys have mostly done this already. So it's a bit of self-assessment now because you're a little bit more self-sufficient. You're not as worried about your buddy. You kind of know what conditions are suitable for you, so it's probably suitable for them. You're both practiced in the use of your own equipment at that point. And although you are a role model for people who are less experienced, you can still be a role model for people who are experienced. So you can have certain techniques or kit setups or, you know, certain ways of doing things that an experienced diver will look at and say, I'm stealing that. I like that. Just because they're not less experienced than you doesn't mean they can't learn from you. And equally, you can't learn from other people. Okay. Right, we're there. 5 minutes to go. So, quick summary, what we've covered, the whole role of the dive leader, who you are, what you're doing, why you're doing the course. The fact that you're going to be continuing the development of your diving skills. We'll talk about this more in detail in another lecture. This is a very introductory lecture, but you're going to be doing skills such as mass clearing at 15 meters rather than 6 meters and that kind of thing. So it's progressing those skills, extending that experience that you've had so far into some more different or different dive sites, for example, and then develop that existing dive leading skill you've had from sports diver by doing the dive leading dive and taking that even further and being a bit more competent on that area so that you can then lead less experienced divers and also dive with divers of equal experience. That is everything on the introductory lecture. So are there any quick questions that I can answer for anyone? Stunned silence.
Yep.
Brilliant. Right. That was an introductory lecture. A lot of that we'll cover in more detail in future. It was a little bit rushed because we were slow to start today. The lecture is recorded and I will try and put that up on YouTube soon if you want to go back and reference it at any point. If you do get any questions that you think of at a later date, just message me, that sort of thing. Apart from that, thank you all for coming.
Do these sports divers, sorry, this is not a question about this, do the sports divers have qualification books or will some of them have them?
As in training packs?
Does the whole book come with a